This is Software Engineering Radio, the podcast for professional developers on the web at se-radio.net. SE Radio is brought to you by the IEEE Computer Society and by IEEE Software Magazine. Online at computer.org/software.
Welcome to Software Engineering Radio. I'm your host, Gavin Henry, and today my guest is Rowland Savage. Rowland Savage is an entrepreneur and corporate development professional who has spent most of his career working with startups in one way or another. He has taken 2 startups from concept through to commercial deployment. As a leader in the corp dev team at Atlassian, Rowland successfully executed a number of deals and was notably part of the team that acquired Trello. Rowland, welcome to Software Engineering Radio.
Hey Gavin, how you doing?
Good, thanks. Is there anything I missed in your bio that you'd like to add?
No, that's pretty much the highlights.
Excellent. I'd like to start with an overview of what a business is, why someone creates a business, and why another person or company acquires a business. What is a business and the types of business in relation to software engineering that you've come across?
So ultimately, a business is an individual or a team who have gotten together to solve a particular problem. We'll have done that with some varying degree of success, from the astoundingly successful to the much less so, as I can attest with some of my own startup experiences. And whenever another business, a larger business, a more established business, seeks to acquire a startup, it's typically for one of 3 reasons. They're interested in the team, as in the experience and the knowledge that the group has or has accumulated. They're interested in the product, and what it is they've built and what it does, its capabilities. Or they're interested in their customers. They want to get access to those customers, either to make them their customers or to maybe sell their products to those customers. And in an ideal situation for the M&A professionals, the corp dev professionals, it would be all 3.
And these businesses, are they different throughout the world, or is it more or less the same in relation to software engineering?
When it comes to software, it seems same but different. So a lot of similarities, but in the US, every state has its own nuances. And across Europe, some countries just have a lot more regulations and red tape to deal with than others.
So it depends on the country you're in, yeah.
Yes. But in general, the standard structure has evolved from all the way back. I think the origins are in Throgmorton Street in London. And that has become a standard limited liability corporation type structure that people use.
And you touched upon a person starts a business to meet a particular need.
Yeah, if they don't, it tends to be short-lived. You know, people that are exploring or trying to figure out what they do after they start the business normally find that's a challenge. The world we live in today, the most effective way to start a business is to start with a problem. And once you've come up with a solution to that problem, more importantly, you find customers that are happy to pay you for that solution, then you know you're onto something that could be its own entity.
So that's a very similar problem space based on some of our other shows we've done and just in software engineering in general, where you don't just create a product to find customers and you don't just create a business to find customers. You should start with the problem space.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, you can create a product to find customers, but the chances are you won't be successful. And I know that sounds harsh, but as you mentioned in my bio, I've had some experience in the venture capital world. And the success rate for startups, I think, is 1 in 20. That's what the statistics were the last times I checked them. So in the last 5 to 10 years, we've just become a lot more efficient at starting companies and having them become successful. And that's part of the lean startup methodology and some of the other, aspects we go about actually building these products. But the key thing is, entrepreneurs will tell you this because we've all experienced it. You've got to find a real pain point, not just something that would be a nice to have.
Yeah, we've done 2 fantastic shows. Episode 448 with Matt on starting your own software company that goes into all those things you've just touched upon. And episode 73 with Joel on startups, growth and valuation, which is highly recommended. Now we've covered the reasons to start a business and the reasons not to start a business. Why does a person or another business buy another business, if that makes sense?
Yeah, the quick answer is for acceleration. So it's a funny thing in the corporate side when you're in the corporate development team. Anytime you look at a startup, so a team of people that have developed some product or capability, and you go talk to your engineering folks, they will always have the same reaction, and that is that we could build this ourselves. So every company typically thinks their engineers are the best, and some of them are. But the issue at hand is both the time it would take to do that, so an allocation of resources, prioritization, and then having the time to actually build the thing. And also an appreciation for the effort that's involved to make a product successful. So whenever Slack built a messaging system, it's not just a case of figuring out the technical challenge of being able to send a short form text message from one user to another. It was all the customer interviews they did, all the effort they put into design, and all the problems they accomplished getting that product to market and solved. And those small things, and I think all the software engineers will appreciate, they just take a huge amount of time.
Yeah, and it's also what to say no to as well, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of, the way I think of corporate development from the corporate side is it's externalized R&D. So if you wanted to kick off all these programs internally, you would have to kick off 10 for every one successful program. So as a result, whenever you look at, if you want to acquire a particular startup, you're typically looking at the ones that have been successful. So you're kind of happy to pay a premium because they have already circumnavigated the risk associated with whatever that particular problem and coming up with that solution was.
Yeah, I think in one of our other shows, I'll put it in the show notes, when we chatted to one of the top guys at Basecamp, they have the idea where they do internal pitches. So I guess that's similar to the corp dev situation where they might have to pitch 10 projects, but they could just go out and buy a company that's successful already.
Yeah, and having it available today, or more or less today, obviously there's a period of time associated with doing the deal and integrating the company. But that's a huge deal, especially as the companies you're acquiring get larger. So if you want to build that thing, it might take you 24 months. Or you could do a deal and 6 months from now, that capability is functional within your product.
And why would a person want to sell a business if they're, if we'd keep the terms acquisition and selling just separate for this question? Does a startup always want to be bought, or do they want to carry on? Or in your experience, what have you seen for the reasons to sell a business?
Yeah, not always. So there are some people that want to do their own thing, be the captain of their own ship, and they may have designs to become the next unicorn or take something all the way through from inception to IPO.
And a unicorn is the $1 billion
company. Yeah. And that's great. And then there's other companies that are successful enough to have free access to venture capital or other financing, in which case they don't need to be acquired, but need, in inverted commas there. So they are able to continue executing on their plan without any external interference. And again, that's great. Now, there are a couple of other categories of people there's people that might want to be acquired. So the most obvious answer might be because of liquidity. So if you start a business, entrepreneurs tend to invest an awful lot of time and money in doing that. And it might be a long time before you're able to see any kind of return on that. So if someone's able to come along and tell you, hey, you can keep doing the job you're doing, but we will give you a pretty decent sum of cash, there's a lot of people who find that attractive. There are people that need to sell their business, so they have raised a certain amount of money. That money will give them a certain timeline to execute on. And if they don't have additional financing lined up, they know if we don't find an exit point before that money runs out, then we're in a lot of trouble. And the final reason people might want to do it is because as you are growing a company, as a founder, your role will change. So if you really enjoy building products, for example, and you are the CTO or the lead product officer of a company, as that company goes, you're going to spend a lot less time building product and a lot more time hiring people and managing people and allocating work. So there is an opportunity for some teams, as they grow, if they're acquired, they can effectively focus on the things that they love doing and building the product, maybe talking to customers, maybe selling the product and figuring out ways to market it, and let the larger company deal with the more, and I'm putting inverted commas again, boring aspects of running a company. And that's the legal, the financial, the chasing up customers, and dealing with all those things that founders inevitably have to deal with after they get to a certain size. So an acquisition is a way sometimes to sort of lock in what you've done and then sort of let the larger company help you scale it. And the scaling part can be quite difficult as well.
Yeah, I understand a lot of those points because they ring home with some of the business people I know. But it sounds quite a personal decision of why you're selling that business.
Yeah, it always is. And I should actually add one more. A lot of people start a business with a goal in mind. And the best way to get to that goal might be through acquisition. So if you have a product, a typical situation startups can find themselves in, where they have a good product, but they don't have the customers, people aren't seeing it, using it. Then if you join forces with a larger company that has users, then that might be the easiest way to get your product into the hands of as many people as possible. And for a lot of people, that kind of is their objective, that they can make the world a better place by having as many folks as possible use their particular tool to help make things more efficient or better.
So it's not just about making money, it's whatever their
Not
strategy and wishes are.
No, and as you said, it's a very personal matter for all founders. And quite frankly, after a certain point, the money matters a lot less to people than satisfying their initial objectives.
And how long does this process normally take if we focus it down to a big company buying a startup?
Do you mean the acquisition process itself?
Yeah, let's go from you've approached someone or you've been approached and you've got some money, whether that's all of your money or some of your money. How long does that normally take?
So there's normally some form of dating period where the companies get to know each other through some mechanism. And that can be a variable amount of time. It can be a long, slow process, or it can be something that happens quite quickly. But the deal normally officially starts whenever a term sheet or an LOI is issued. And that is where the headline terms are agreed between both the company and the startup to be acquired.
That's letter of intent, is that?
Letter of intent, yes.
That basically says, this is what we want to do and how much we're going to pay.
It's basically saying, hey, I really do want to buy you, which is, it's good to hear that in explicit terms. We would like to pay this amount of money. We would like to pay that amount of money over these certain terms. Most commonly, we'll do it over a period of time. And we have these expectations. You might come and work at our headquarters, or you might continue to run the business for 12 months, or you might start working for someone within our organization. And that kicks off the mini sort of round of negotiations where both sides have to agree that this deal is what they want. And the general shape and form is something that's acceptable to both parties. In my book, I've likened that to an engagement proposal to get married. So it's non-binding, but it's not something that should be taken lightly. And both parties should be committed to making it work if it's accepted.
And it's a bit more than a prenuptial, isn't it?
It's a bit more than that, yeah. So from that point to actually receiving funds at the end of the deal, it can be done in 45 days. I'd say 90 days is probably a more realistic time frame to wrap your head around. It depends a lot on the size of the company. It depends a lot on the complexity of the company. It depends a lot on how familiar both sides are with each other. So, for example, if you've integrated with the company, if you're on regular speaking terms with engineers or product managers at the acquiring company, if this is a conversation that's been had before and floated, that might be a very quick process. If you're a simple company with offices in one area, everyone signed all their agreements, your customer agreements are quite straightforward, then the process can go very quickly. But especially in today's world, even small companies can get very complex. So you can have employees in multiple countries. You can have customers in multiple countries under different agreements. And all of these are things that the acquiring company needs to understand and needs to figure out a plan of how to integrate that into their overall offering and how things will look once the deal is completed.
Excellent. I'm going to move us on to the next section. Just to summarize your last answer, it just depends on what that product is, how they do, how long they've been in business, what countries.
It does, but I would put that 90-day figure. So okay. Even very large deals can be completed. Maybe it's longer than that. Maybe it's 4 months rather than 3 months. But they don't go on for years once the LOI has been agreed. It's incumbent on everyone to move quickly at that point. And ironically, doing a small deal can sometimes be more time consuming than doing a larger deal.
Thank you. So you touched upon this in the first section, types of acquisitions. Now that we've covered the basics, I'd like to explore the main types of acquisition. In your book, you list 3 types. Can you tell me what these 3 types are?
Yeah, so the three main reasons a company might want to buy a startup is to acquire either the team, the technology, or their customers, or ideally all three. So if a company is acquiring the team, that's in the Valley here is known as an acqui-hire, if they're only acquiring the team. And the reason why a company might want to do that is because the team has some set of specialist skills. So you'll see that happen, for example, if you have a team of Stanford PhDs that are working on an AI algorithm, and the larger company wants to create, for want of a better term, an AI department. Well, the easy thing they could do is acquire that team and then put them to work to solve the problem they have in mind.
And how would they get to know each other, the artificial intelligence team? Is it they just in the same circles?
That's the role of corporate development. So corporate development will be scanning the ecosystems that the company is active in and reaching out to companies and developing relationships.
So just like business development and sales. Yeah.
Much like that. The other way it happens is inbound. So for example, that small company might have an integration, might have a marketplace app, or might otherwise be engaged with the developers, and perhaps through meetups or through some common program, in which case they get on the company's radar internally. It's recognized then that it'd be valuable to spend time getting to know them.
So that's an acqui-hire in the Valley, Californian.
That's right. And those are at varying degrees of attractiveness depending on how available developers are at that point in time.
Okay, so and the second type would be?
Yeah, for the product. So the team has built some capability, solved some problem that is interesting to the company. So an example of that, while I was at Atlassian, we bought a video conferencing technology to integrate with HipChat, which was a competitor to Slack. So that's a very clear-cut case of we need to find someone that has built a video conferencing platform that is reliable, that has an architecture that would fit with our architecture, and is amenable to the idea of joining a larger company and integrating that platform with a messaging system. So in that case, you're looking for someone that has a very clear set of technical requirements.
And that's something driven by the acquiring company?
By the acquiring company, and specifically the technical or product team within that company. So they will have a mind that is this something perhaps we could build ourselves, or we could buy if something's already out there. And in this case, I mean, I think of the amount of effort involved with building a good and stable platform like that. You know, it's probably tens of years worth of effort. So it's a nice pick to be able to plug that in.
It's some in-depth knowledge needed for video codecs and all that type of stuff. And the third type again?
Then for customers, the company's interested in the customers. So in each of those two previous times, so I mean, they're obviously all related. So if you're interested in the product, then the team that's built that product is obviously of interest too. Now, when acquiring for the product, the company may or may not be interested in the customers that the team has captured through that product. So the company might see the acquisition as a new line of business. They might see the acquisition of a way to get into an adjacent line of business, or they might see the acquisition as a way to cross-sell their products to the startups' customers. So in all instances, acquiring for access to the customers is going to be more valuable probably than just acquiring the product itself or just acquiring the team.
But they might not care about the customers and just want the product.
They might not care.
Yeah.
The larger company might have so many customers that whatever number that the startup has, it might be interesting from the startup perspective, but much less so from a large company perspective.
That leads us nicely on to my next question is, do some companies do acquisitions to kill technology or to learn about or gain expertise in that technology, i.e. not caring so much about the revenue or products?
Almost all companies will care more about the technology probably than the customers involved. I say almost all. Again, it depends. Again, if someone was to buy Slack, they have whatever many tens of millions of users. That's interesting. You know, that's valuable.
Yeah, Salesforce bought Slack not too long ago. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But a lot of the times the company is buying the technical capability. Companies generally don't buy other companies just to shut them down. That's an expensive way to put a competitor out of business. I think it's illegal under certain circumstances. But it's also just, if you want to compete with, why not just compete with them? Why not just beat them by building a better product or offering a lower price? We're doing something along those lines. Now, that doesn't mean the companies aren't acquired and the product line sunsetted eventually. We see that happen. I think Microsoft acquiring Wunderlist, I think they've sunsetted that. That's a good example. But it tends to be more of a change of priorities or change of direction. Or perhaps the intention was made to buy a technology with the goal of scaling it. And it just turns out after deep investigation, that just doesn't work. That was a premise that ultimately couldn't be proven.
So again, it comes down to what is of interest to the acquiring company, really.
Yes. And one of the points I try to get to in my book is it's really important for the people on the startup side to really understand what the acquiring company has in mind. So all of these approaches are valid, providing people know what they're getting into. So if there's a risk associated with shutting a program down, for example, if startups see that as their baby and under no circumstances do they want that product to be, end of life, they need to know that going in. And it sort of behoves everyone involved to have that conversation openly.
I've got a link to your book in the show notes, but just to let the listeners know, it's called How to Stick Landing, or you can tell me what it's called.
How to Stick the Landing, the M&A Handbook for Startups.
Excellent. So in your experience and what you've been through yourself and what you see, which type of those three types of acquisition are most successful?
In almost all circumstances, it's the combination. I would say the customers matter less for a lot of the deals that are done. People are interested in the combination of the team and technology. However, customers validate the technology. So if you've built something and nobody wants to use it, it has to be a pretty well understood niche case for someone to want to buy that.
It's quite a chicken and egg, isn't it?
It is. But you don't necessarily, if you've got 100 customers, for example, that might be enough to validate the product.
Yeah, you've got a varied enough input from customers to have the right feature set and give you some guidance.
Yeah. So it's always nice when there's customers, but a lot of the time, for example, these larger companies like a Salesforce might simply be looking at your company as an additional feature they would add in, perhaps not even charge for, just to improve the customer experience and the retention associated with it.
And are you allowed to talk about the reasons that Atlassian bought Trello?
Just in broad terms.
Yeah. Where would they fit in the types?
Well, there was definitely a highly talented team there, and they had a fantastic product. So Trello, I don't think it was a secret. They were monetizing their customer set, and they did have an awful lot of customers. But I think what was exciting for Atlassian was this lightweight, visual, very easy to use, intuitive tool that Trello had created, and what that would bring to the Atlassian offering, which at the time was Jira tends to be quite a heavyweight tool, command line driven more than...
Oh, the Jira or Jira, I don't know how you say it.
Yeah.
The ticketing system, source control.
It's very, very successful, but it's kind of it's a product built by engineers for engineers. So you can see that there's having Trello definitely represents the whole new way of sort of building products. And that was very valuable to Atlassian. And then in terms, I think for Trello, having access to the enormous ecosystem of Atlassian customers and their products, which, an awful lot of people use, was one of those sort of win-win scenarios.
And it was a success.
Yeah, I think so.
Excellent. We actually use Trello to do all the different stages of the shows at Software Engineering Radio.
Yeah, they're a great bunch. They have just a tremendous team there. It's a great pleasure to work with them.
It's a product I like. Excellent. I'm going to take us on to the next section. I'd like to discuss getting a line for an offer, i.e. going out and trying to find someone to acquire you, or what happens if you are approached out of the blue. So if you are approached, so you haven't had any intention to plan, or maybe you have, to be acquired, is there a particular way to value your startup, or how do you do that?
Yeah, I think you're asking two different questions there. So first and foremost, it's how these offers manifest. And my key piece of advice here is not to be surprised. And by that, I mean, if you are a startup, you should, as you're developing along your journey, have a good idea for the type of folks that might be interested in acquiring your business, because they're probably your closest neighbors or biggest competitors. They also, as you're developing, will probably have a number of programs that you might want to avail yourself of. And those are the partnership programs, the hackathons, even engaging with them. A lot of large companies have programs that have outreach towards startups. It's a good way to get access to knowledge and expertise and even advice.
So it's less likely that you would be approached. It's something you should be thinking about.
Yeah. You don't have to do a deal, but you should know who might be interested in buying you. And whenever you're talking to a startup and they just think, well, it'll be Google. It's like, well, would it? Think through that. And who might be blogging right now? Give that example of the video technology. You should, it's incumbent on the leader of a company like that to know who's interested in video technology right now, who's writing blogs about, wouldn't it be great to have a great video technology? Because if not an acquisition opportunity, that might be a business development opportunity. That might be a customer prospect.
Yeah, it could be a partnership rather than an acquisition.
Yeah, so it's never clear at the start of the conversation where it might lead. And that's true in the company side too. So the roots of becoming a customer, becoming a partner, or becoming an acquirer, they all start the same way. And that starts with hearing about the startup, getting to know the startup, and getting to understand the startup's capabilities.
We'll stick with the startup that has intention of being acquired and they're putting themselves in the different circles. Is a startup valuation different from a valuation of a business that is fully sufficient or has been going a while?
The principles are the same. I mean, there's a risk associated if the company requires additional financing in order to remain solvent. And then the next question would be, how likely are they to get that additional financing? But just to be specific, whether the offer is solicited or has been worked towards, valuation is as much an art as it is a science. So things that startup founders want to keep in mind is look for comparable transactions. So look for companies that are in some shape or form like yours that have been acquired and how much and the amounts have been disclosed, which does not always happen, probably only happens less than half the time, I suspect. And the reason that's important is it is very hard to value a business that doesn't have a stable, recurring, growing revenue stream. It gets very subjective at that point of view. And it's also worth pointing out that a company, the same company, might be worth different amounts to different acquirers. The reason being that whenever I acquire a startup, I am going to want to, let's say, either sell their product to my customers or sell my product to their customers or some combination of the two. And depending on what my product is, the number of customers I have, my price point, I might arrive at a very different valuation as a different company that has more or less customers or charges a greater or lower amount for their product. And that's something to keep in mind. Both valuations will be correct from the perspective of the acquirer.
And I suppose it depends. Say a company's running stuff in private hybrid clouds and another one's purely in the cloud. It depends how the acquirer does things. Some of that might be useful, some of it might not be, so that can change.
Yeah, the maxim is that all deals are different. But the question is, how much does the acquirer value what you've done? If they value all the aspects about what you've built, how you've built it, how you deploy it, etc., you should feel that you're going to get an offer reflecting the full value at that point in time. If they only want part of it, let's say you're an on-prem solution and a cloud solution, and they're only interested in the cloud solution, then that on-prem side of your business is effectively worthless to the acquiring company. Now, again, there's some sense of negotiation when it comes to determining value, where there's got to be an acknowledgement that got to meet somewhere in the middle. But it's always worthwhile keeping that in mind.
They could just see one part of that as something that's a pain and they're going to have to sunset at some point and do migrations.
Yes.
So that leads me nicely on to my next question. Where do we see the crazy numbers come from in the press? The unicorns, and they might be a team of 20 or 30, but they're just valued way, way, way more than makes sense. Do you have any insight as to how that works?
Well, I would question are they valued more than makes sense? Are those numbers crazy? So, and by that, I'm not being cute, but it's a small numbers of people, small groups of people have created products that have been enormously successful and have attracted huge numbers of customers and potentially generated huge amounts of revenue. So whenever you see those silly numbers, someone has sat down and think this company will generate revenues that would justify that valuation. And either they are doing it or there is a path that they will do it at some point in the future. People doing these deals generally aren't stupid. They're not throwing money away. They see some super valuable pathway. I've actually got an analogy there to think about, and it's whenever Google bought YouTube. At the time, I believe that was pillared as, I think they paid $1 billion at the time. I think that deal was pillared as being you're crazy for paying so much money for YouTube, and that was just the height of extravagance. Whereas what would YouTube be worth now if it was independently valued? It's something billions of people use every day. The question is, how much is that company worth to that particular acquirer and why?
And that cleverness and insight comes from the team getting bought to say, hold on a minute, we're potentially worth this much to you.
Again, I would think very much, my goal in life is to try to break down the barrier between the acquirer and the acquired. I mean, ultimately, whenever you're deciding to join forces, again, go back to that marriage analogy, it's a marriage. You have a shared goal you're working towards. So by themselves, there is a value to be created through an acquisition in that by themselves, the smaller company may not be able to achieve the greatness that could be achieved through the acquisition. Whenever we build a business case for acquisition, one of the questions we answer is, how does 1 + 1 = 3? How, by putting our two pieces of the puzzle together, do we get something that's greater than the sum of the parts?
I understand, yeah. So yeah, it's really, again, comes down to the desires of the people selling and the bigger picture.
Yeah, and ultimately that combined offering might be closer to realizing the vision of both companies than they do by themselves.
Getting back to the offer stage, now that we've covered off crazy numbers are in fact lack of insight from the reading of the article maybe. We've touched on the timeline and the stages after an offer letter. Could you just give us a recap on that?
Yeah, so after the LOI has been agreed, typically the stages after that will be due diligence, which is for the acquiring company to understand everything about what it is they're buying. Will be the agreement of the legal documentation, which is largely a stage of lawyers arguing with each other and working out the fine detail from a legal perspective of the deal. There will be a phase of integration, which should begin before the deal closes, but will be, in effect, the sequence of steps that happen immediately after the deal closes. And then closing itself. Closing is when people put their signatures on paper, shake hands. From a legal perspective, the two become one.
And at the closing stage,
yes,
if you're already having chats about integration and obviously everything really NDA'd and all that type of stuff, so you're sharing things.
Yes.
At what point up until completion can you both just go, nah, I'm not interested?
The common refrain is a deal's not done till it's done. So right up until both signatures are exchanged and the legal documents have been executed, one party can walk away from the transaction.
But you still just go on faith. And
yeah, so the process is set up to build confidence as you go through. So for example, if there's some problem with the term sheet, with the LOI, then you need to have that conversation before you go and spend 6 figures on lawyers and accountants and anyone else you might need. You don't want to disrupt your business for 3 months just to ultimately walk away. So it's important to have those hard conversations earlier. And I mentioned integration because that's a huge deal to understand post-deal who you're going to be reporting to. Is the founder going to be reporting directly to the CEO, or is it going to be reporting to someone 4 or 5 levels down? Does the team have to relocate or not? Does everyone in the team get a job or not? Will the condition?
Yeah, I've seen your helpful guide at the back of your book sort of help you go through that. And I've seen some deals in the press and things and some chats I've had with some other guests where integrations just either stagnate or just don't happen. The acquired company may have been better being just a partner if they haven't got that bit nailed.
Yeah, well, this is something that's important for both sides to agree on. So the most important determinant for the success of a deal is the integration. And that needs to be thought through. And it's important because there are different people involved in the doing of the deal. So the folks involved in actually doing the deal are not the same folks that are going to be involved with running the combined entity.
We're going to touch upon integration in the next section.
Okay, cool.
So you're moving along nicely. You've done completion. Do you then get a big fat check in one go? Or not a check, but you know what I mean? How does that work?
Yeah, so typically once the deal closes, there will be some transfer of funds. So the way deals normally work, I'll speak just to my experience here in Silicon Valley, is Typically, you will be given some portion of the funds at closing and then have a retention piece that will probably vest over the 2 to 4 years. So imagine you get a fifth of the funds upon closing, then another fifth after year 1, another fifth after year 2, another fifth after year 3, another fifth after year 4. So upon closing, yes, wires will be initiated, but not for the full amount. So it would be a very foolish thing for an acquiring company to suddenly hand different group of people a large check and then just hope everything works out after that. And that's really not in everyone's best interest.
And that's also called an earnout.
Depending on the structure, yes, it can be an earnout.
Yeah.
Or a holdback is the other way it's commonly done.
And does it cost money to be acquired? I think we touched on that a little bit.
Yes. Most importantly, it costs a lot of time and effort from the founders. It will be disruptive for a period of months while you go through the process.
And that halts everything else, doesn't it?
Yeah, so you've got to be careful. One of the scariest things for me being on corporate side when acquiring a startup was making sure that we didn't topple them like a small boat, been toppled by, the wake of a big boat while we went through that process. Because remember, there is a potential that you would walk away after occupying their mind and their headspace for a couple of months. You always have to be as cautious about that and as efficient as possible. In addition, commonly you would spend 6 figures on a lawyer to work through this process as well, or something close to that.
Talking about the lawyers and accountants, how much does the acquiring company need to know about your company?
Everything, right? The acquiring company can't acquire you and then suddenly find out that you've been sued. Well, that just can't happen. They can't acquire you and find there's employee issues. They can't acquire you and find out actually you had a founder who kind of owns the IP or could make a claim on owning the IP after the deal closes and sue them for more than the deal is worth.
So that could be something like they created the software themselves before they started their legal entity?
Not just that. Again, I'm not up to date on UK law, but if everyone who's ever worked for the company hasn't signed an IP assignment to the company, then the company itself doesn't have full chain of custody on the IP, which means someone could buy the company and someone else comes out of the woodwork and say, hey, I worked on that. I worked on the really important piece. And it's really hard to prove that they didn't. And they potentially could have a legal claim. And that's just a huge headache nobody wants to deal with.
And that's covered under the term due diligence, isn't it? All of that.
Yes.
And what sort of team is typical to have on the side of the company getting acquired? So not the big company, the small company.
Typically, you'll have the founders involved with probably definitely someone to provide legal advice. So a good M&A lawyer, and then probably someone help on the finance side.
And M&A is mergers and acquisitions.
Mergers and acquisition, yes. And then someone on the finance side. So part of the process will be to review audited financials and make sure everything's understood and clear. Now, that might be the CFO if the company's had it. It might be one of the board members if they're experienced, or it could be an independent financial advisor.
Okay, just to round off this section, we're bang on time, so that's good. So yeah, due diligence, telling them everything you need to know. You need a good team to support you to make sure you're not getting into something on both sides that you're not privy to. And if you're allowed to say, I don't think I've asked this already, how did the Atlassian one happen again? They approached Trello, is that correct?
It's funny, it's something I was just writing about. Those large deals, and the Trello deal was a $425 million deal.
It's pretty large.
Yeah, those are in process for, Trello was on our radar for years. Scott would make a point of trying to meet with Joel and Michael whenever he was in New York. So we tried to build a relationship over a period of time and understand where they were and where they were going. So it's hard to come up with just one inception point. That's why when I say it shouldn't be, these acquisition offers shouldn't come out of the blue. You should know someone's interested in you and be helpful in facilitating those relationships.
Excellent. So let's say we've been bought, the press is out, we're all extremely happy. We've got to do the integration and we may potentially head off into the sunset once that earn-out or handover period is done. So how do we start merging things at all? Is that decided up front before completion, or? Ideally,
at least at a high level, it is. There's actually a lot of things that needs to happen in reasonably short order. So, for example, if you have customers or generating revenue, you've got to combine that with the acquiring company. So how you go about buying or acquiring customers has got to be aligned with their way of going about combining customers. And then where are the cash flows, the systems they run through, and how they're ultimately reconciled. There needs to be a plan for combining those, ultimately moving to one standard. The various groups have to get to know each other. So the way you build product has to align with how the big company builds the product. And there needs to be a plan of how they're going to be integrated. The specifics of that depends on, sometimes you'll find companies run more or less independently for 6 to 12 months. Or right away, it might be, how do we plumb our system into your system so we can offer that joint offering to the customers?
So you've got the financial part, the sales part, the operational part, all to merge and align.
Yeah, the HR part probably happens before deal closing, in that all the employees are given new contracts. Whatever share saved or whatever share scheme they were on with the old company, they're now on a new one with the new company. So that has to happen as well.
Did you say share scheme there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Equity,
yeah. And have you ever seen instances where a company buys a product to get product market fit and the customers, but scraps the product and rewrites it all from scratch? That'd be pretty crazy.
I haven't personally seen that. It's not that crazy. So I think it's common as products grow and expand that they're all rewritten or certainly redeveloped as they go. So it is possible that you might acquire effectively turn a version 2.0 of the product that may be perhaps written on a different platform that's more scalable, or utilizing new languages or capabilities that the startup team wasn't as familiar with. So in general, I would think of it more of an iteration or an evolution rather than a scrapping.
And in general, do things always run smoothly with the integration?
In general, things tend to not run smoothly, but that's the challenge. So there's a transition period. Well, actually, let's start off with a nice bit. Let's start off with a honeymoon period. So whenever a deal happens, normally everyone's very excited about that. So there's a new shiny thing been brought into the company, and everyone's quite damn excited to have that.
And I think in your book, you discuss being loved to death, don't you?
Yes. Well, if you think about it, and a company that has 100 people in it, and they've been bought by a company that has 5,000 people in it, you suddenly find every engineer wants to talk to the very small number of engineers on the other side. And suddenly they're spending the whole first month fielding coffee requests. And because they don't know who's who in the new organization, people tend to be very polite. So they effectively can be brought to a standstill just through people being curious and interested and wanting to wish them well, which is all good. But like all things, there needs to be balance there.
And how do they protect themselves in those situations?
Ideally, there should be an integration manager on the company side who can effectively be the bad cop to say, hey, these people already have jobs which occupied 100% of their time before being acquired. They now have to do all the acquisition activities, which is probably another good 100% of their time. And they are going to want to meet and integrate and connect and understand everything about the new company. So we just can't do everything all at once. So maybe let's phase things in. Let's take things gradually.
And does all the knowledge get transferred?
I don't know if the knowledge, if it needs to get transferred, but there are definitely interfaces need to happen. So there's going to be some connection points. So at a product level or at an engineering level, you definitely want a mind meld to happen certainly between key resources on both sides. But overall, ideally, the startup that's been acquired should be able to bring some new energy, maybe some new processes, maybe some new practices about how they do things, because startups can normally move quickly, iterate quickly. And the larger company, in turn, can help with, okay, here's the more standardized processes we use, because for a large company with many customers, stability is key. Providing customer support, et cetera, is key. So if you can combine those things, that should be quite powerful. But it takes time, and it takes time for both sides to kind of get comfortable with each other.
And it should be mapped out before.
It should be mapped out, like all things. I mean, you should have a plan, and then you should have the ability to stray off plan where necessary.
And is that usually part of the payouts over the next few years?
In an ideal world, the payouts should be time-based. Everyone should be understood to be doing their best in the situation. Sometimes the payouts will be milestone-based. And the reason why I caution accepting that is because the person who accepts the milestone payment may not be in full control of all the effort that's required to satisfy the milestone. And I'll give you a very simple example. Let's say you agree that you have 500,000 customers and you agree that you would get a big payment when you get to 1 million customers. But in order to do that, you need to add an extra 100 engineers. And then when recruiting comes around, you're only able to add 50 engineers. So if everyone's making best efforts, you're in a sticky situation there, so people are working hard to meet their goal, but for reasons sort of not their fault, they're unable to complete that goal.
It's not really done until those 2 to 4 years are complete, is it?
Yeah, that would be the best situation, is that you're working to that 2 to 4 year plan where after that time, both all the knowledge has been, integrated to the combined company. The two products are effectively one product. And at that point, it becomes much less important to know, who came from company A or company B. They're just kind of the one team at that point.
And do they ever do milestones, payments based on your turnover of that company?
That can happen. It depends on the specific of the deal.
So yeah, it just depends on what's going on. And what happens if the thing you love the most in your startup isn't used? Say you've got a couple of products, but they're not interested in your baby. Is that just something you have to suck up?
Well, that should be something that could have been perceived before the deal's done. And if it's really important to you, you should be aware of that. The thing to remember, when you've sold your company, you have sold your company. So you are ceding control to someone else. What can happen sometime is that priorities simply change in the world around. So, for example, COVID just happened last year. I can guarantee roadmaps were rewritten.
Oh, yeah, I did hear about that.
Regardless of the intent, the real world comes into play. And suddenly something might be dropped, something might be reprioritized. That's just part of the process. And ideally, the thing you love most is probably the thing that makes you most interesting to the acquirer. That's usually how it works. You would be working on some plan to get that thing into as many people's hands as possible. Again, there is a reality there that's just got to be acknowledged.
And that's potentially something you could build into the terms of the 2 to 4 years.
Yeah, potentially.
So how do we confirm or validate a successful or unsuccessful or failure of an acquisition? Did the acquisition succeed?
It's actually harder to do than you might think. So the only way you could reasonably do that is if you have a stated shared goal at the time of the acquisition. So if you have we're going to buy product A, combine it with product B, and at the end of 4 years, we expect to have 1 million users using it, or we expect to be generating $10 million worth of revenue through that. Then it's very clear to say whether it's successful or not successful. In the reality, 4 years after an acquisition, the companies have been reorganized several times, especially if it's high growth. The teams have been combined. The products have been combined. And it's very hard to pick apart what part was product A and what part was product B. Also, the benefits might be hard to quantify. So take the example where you are buying a small company that turns into a feature in a much larger product that customers are using, and it creates more delight with those customers. Well, how do you attribute increased customer happiness or lower or higher customer retention to that one feature? Because there's a lot more going along.
So it's quite hard to define the success criteria for an acquisition.
It is, and over what time period? Again, going back to the Google deal with YouTube, it did turn out to be hugely successful, but not right away. It was probably years later.
And how would you know if the acquisition failed?
Sometimes it's obvious. Sometimes there'll be a combined go-to-market effort that just doesn't work. Sometimes you acquire customers and customers leave because they like working with a small company and they don't want to be with the large company, or they don't want to be with that particular large company. Sometimes there's a breakdown with the founding team and they'll leave. Sometimes that happens publicly. Yeah,
you mentioned that in your book, to always think about the fact that you're going to, I'm paraphrasing, but basically always think you're going to come across those people again, as you should. Treat other people in life as not slight everyone.
Yeah, and it is a hard process, and that's the other thing to acknowledge. I mean, combining two of these can be difficult. And also the role of the startup CEO within a larger organization can be very powerful if they know how to leverage you, or can just not be. You could then be someone that is just making waves within a much more structured environment. And that might be a difficult. There has to be some evolution of role there.
Can you anticipate these types of failures? You probably get a few signs up front.
Sometimes. I mean, it's the good fences make for good neighbors. I mean, as much as possible, you want to have discussions on alignment and especially roles before the deal closes. So transparency is key here. It was a gift at Atlassian. One of their values is open company, and that allowed us to be clear. Here's how things are going to be. And those conversations aren't always easy, and on both sides. But it's best that they're had and they're not sort of eventually evolved into. When it's not clear who's going to report to who, or when it's not clear what that combined offering is going to be, or who's going to drive, that's where the frictions can tend to bubble up to the surface.
And have you seen situations where it didn't fail, but there might have been some overpayment in terms of the actual value that they got?
Again, it's hard to quantify that. What I will say is I've seen a situation where the full value hadn't been realized in the time along the original timeline. And it was just that additional priorities got in the way. But then eventually that move was taken and it seemed to be quite successful.
I guess potentially a lot of companies that acquired and completion just happened before March last year, couldn't have predicted 12 months of COVID. So
these things happen. I mean, it was for you and I, 2008 wasn't that long ago. There are corrections in the market, and not just that. There's new competitors. There's new people. There's new approaches. So you're kind of hitting a moving object with a moving object, to get to a new destination. But that's part of it. If someone has acquired your business for a reason, especially if it's significant, the chances are that is something that's important to them. They want to follow through on it.
So measuring business value and getting the most out of the acquisition should be a given at the start, but things change over the 2 to 4 years.
Things change over time, yeah.
And are there companies out there that look at acquisitions and treat them like a portfolio, where they care about the overall return but expect some to fail, kind of like private equity and investors and things?
Yeah, that's particularly the model of private equity investors. And what they're typically trying to do is find an asset company and then apply whatever their system is to enable that asset more. So part of that system might be, for example, that they have industry connections, or they have back office support, or they have scaling through the next stage of the company. And typically they will invest in a lot or buy a lot of companies and kind of run them pretty hard to see the return thereafter.
And that would be your sort of classic round A, round B, C type funding, where they're getting money but not actually relinquishing all of the ownership of the company.
No. So I would treat venture capital investment, or the intent is very much to invest in the team that's operating the company and help them get to the next stage. Whereas a private equity investment tends to be larger typically, and also tends to be more to alter course somehow, or adjust course, or accelerate the course through some specific mechanism.
That's your PE and your VC, isn't it, when you read about that?
The line blurs between some of them these days, but you'll kind of know it when you see it.
Excellent. I think that's been a great summary of the timelines. I'd like to start wrapping up the show now, if that's okay, Roland. Knowing what is involved in being acquired is extremely important for software engineers and companies. But if there's one thing a budding entrepreneur should remember from our show, what would you like that to be?
It's just to be mindful about the process. It's good to understand the process, and knowledge is power. So if you know what's going to happen, you're better prepared to deal with it and have the conversations you really need to have.
And getting a copy of your book would be the best starting place.
Yeah, that's probably a good starting point, yeah.
And is there anything key or anything at all that I missed that you'd like to mention?
Not really. The one thing I would talk about is this need for transparency in the process. That's a two-way street. So I think it behoves the acquiring companies to be transparent about their intentions, because you can short circuit some conversations very quickly. But also for the startups being acquired, to be as open as you possibly can. It's very hard to have conversations, and I've had it where someone said, you should buy us. And I'd say, well, how many customers have you got? And I say, I'm not telling you. Says, well, how does your product work? I'm not telling you that either. And it's like, how do you expect me to buy you? I just hope that what you're saying is true. It's like, that really doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, I suppose that's kind of like the car analogy. I want to buy that car, but you're not allowed to see it, or you're not allowed to test drive it. It's like, well, how can I really understand?
Yeah. And as I said, the processes about how we develop software are changing. So it's got, like, most people are blogging their customer numbers, or been very open about the amounts they're raising and their headcounts and things like that. So a lot of the times this isn't sensitive information. It's stuff that can be readily shared and might help the company get to a decision.
But some of it is press release, though, so you have to dig into it a bit. Yeah. I've got a minute or so left. I've got a question about Atlassian and Trello. What was the most difficult part, if you're allowed to say? Or what could have been prepared for better during the whole process?
No, I think if I was to say from an outsider, probably the most difficult part was convincing them to sell the business, because they were kind of doing so well by themselves. So there's a truism in acquisitions that the company you want to acquire don't want to sell themselves because they're doing so well.
That's a very good point. Why would you?
And the companies that want you to buy them, you probably don't want to buy them because they want to sell because they're not seeing the growth.
Yeah, they might big up themselves quite a lot.
Yeah, so the key is trying to identify a shared goal and how both sides can kind of contribute towards that goal.
Which kind of goes back to the point of finding the pain point to solve in your business or your product.
Yeah, ultimately, yes.
Perfect. So where can people find out more if they want to reach out? You've got your Twitter account. How else can people get in touch?
Yeah, LinkedIn, look for Rowland Savage, or visit my website at corpdev.io.
And you've got a medium.com presence.
I do have a Medium website, and I have a series now on adding transparency to the M&A process. And that is just Rowland Savage on Medium, I think.
Rowland, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a real pleasure. This is Gavin Henry for Software Engineering Radio. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to SE Radio, an educational program brought to you by IEEE Software Magazine. For more about the podcast, including other episodes, visit our website at se-radio.net. To provide feedback, you can comment on each episode on the website or reach us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, or through our Slack channel at seradio.slack.com. You can also email us at team@se-radio.net. This and all other episodes of SE Radio is licensed under Creative Commons License 2.5. Thanks for listening.